So how are foreign investors such as ourselves looking at the Brazilian market right now? I think there are a lot of positives. I think the overall view of foreign investors of the Brazilian market is a positive outlook. That is particularly post the pension reform. That was a crucial milestone for the investment case for Brazil. But over and above that, the microeconomic reforms that are ongoing in this administration are seen very positively by investors. Of course, we have to wait and see how many of those will actually be executed, but it's a very positive platform and a very broad platform across areas such as privatization, tax reform, debureaucratization as it's called. So I think it's a very positive outlook. Having said that, I think there are two clouds on the horizon, if you like. Well, the first one isn't really on the horizon, it's right now, which is the lackluster growth of the Brazilian economy, that we have been expecting growth to pick up every year for several years now. Every year, forecasts for GDP growth start optimistic and then they gradually become less and less and less optimistic as the year goes on. And so we've seen expectations for growth in 2019 disappoint yet again, just like expectations for growth disappointed in 2018 and 2017. So I think for the investment case of Brazil to really take off, we need not only the pension reform, absolutely crucial, not only the very positive story around microeconomic reform, but we also need to see some real growth of the economy. The other cloud on the horizon is the global picture. And I don't really have a particular global macroeconomic forecast to share or to throw out there, except to make the very obvious observation, and I say very obvious because it's become very clear in the last month with the sharp sell-off in the Brazilian market and the Brazilian currency, that Brazil is a high beta market. And what we mean by a high beta market is that when global risk sentiment turns sour, the Brazilian market feels the brunt of that, and the Brazilian market sells off more than a typical or more than the average emerging market. But vice versa, if global sentiment picks up, if global markets are strong, then that will be particularly strong for the Brazilian market. So for better or worse, we not only have to look at the domestic picture, but also the global picture. How to reconcile the perceived short-term focus of investors with the long-term needs of companies in the digital era? I think that at the heart of this is the classic corporate governance or investor challenge of so-called short-termism, the perception that investors are exclusively focused on short-term numbers, particularly quarterly profit numbers, whereas companies need to focus on the long term, where the long term is several years. The idea is that this matters particularly in the context of digital transformation, where the benefits, the payback from investments, from strategies that focus on digital transformation may be many years forward, and yet investors are only looking at the next quarter's profits. How to reconcile this? Well, I think the good news is that the gap here, I'm not saying there is no gap, but I think the gap between the long-term focus of companies and the short-term focus of investors is exaggerated. What we've seen, particularly in the last few years, and we see particularly in the markets in New York, but I think we're seeing them increasingly in the domestic markets in Brazil, is that investors are able to analyze companies beyond the quarterly profit numbers. Investors are able to look at things, for example, in the context of e-commerce companies. Investors are able to look at other metrics than purely price to profits, price to earnings, or PE. They're able to look at things like enterprise value to gross merchandise value. That's the enterprise value of the business divided by the total value of merchandise that's sold through a platform. That's just to use one example. So I do think it's an exaggeration that people sometimes have, or an exaggerated perception that investors are only focused on quarterly numbers and that companies cannot handle that short-termism. I think the short-termism concern is exaggerated.